Begin script. By the fourth night of the Black Spruce Freeze, the camp called Smoke Hollow had vanished. Wind tore across the flats near 30 miles an hour. The cold had dropped to almost 50 below. Snow buried the ground between bunkhouse and stable. Inside, the bench was cooling, and smoke had returned to the rafters. Fallen mortar blocked the return. Aili Korpela tied a rope around her waist and put the other end in Rowan Mercer's hands. Fail, and the men chose between smoke and cold. Elma, 11, called the minutes by the fire. Miko lay fevered in a bunk built for a lost child. Leander Moss, who called the bench a mud coffin, guarded the buried air intake. 26 horses stiffened behind a frozen door. The rope jerked once. Then it went slack. 9 weeks earlier, Aili had walked into an all-male camp with 2 hungry children and offered to mend the one thing every man had stopped believing could be mended. How did a widow asking only for food become the 158 loggers trusted to keep them alive? Late in November of 1900, Aili Korpela reached Black Spruce No. 7 carrying a repair satchel in one hand and her sleeping son in the other. The freight driver had left them at the fork. His horse was blown, the camp road climbed, and he would not risk a leg for 3 passengers who could not pay. So Aili walked the last miles with Miko against her shoulder and Elma beside her, and the snow came up over the tops of their boots. Miko was 4 and light as a bundle of kindling. That was not a thing to be glad of. Aili shifted him higher and kept her eyes on the ruts. Elma walked with one mitten closed tight. Inside the mitten was the last of the bread. She had carried it from Winton Crossing, 31 miles back, and had not eaten it. She thought her mother did not know. Aili knew. She said nothing. A child who hoards has learned that tomorrow is not promised, and no words fix that. Only tomorrows fix that. They smelled the camp before they saw it, not wood smoke rising clean the way smoke should. This smoke lay low under the spruce, flat and gray, and it did not lift. Then the bunkhouse door swung open, and men came out coughing into the cold. They stood in the trampled snow with their eyes streaming, waving the air in front of their faces. After a minute, the worst of it thinned, and they went back inside. Aili counted. Before she reached the yard, the door opened twice more. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched the roof line instead of the men. The chimney at the north end of the bunkhouse pushed its smoke out sideways. It rolled down the shakes, caught under the eave, and slid along the ground toward the trees. Elma looked up at her. "It's the wind," Elma said, because that was what the freight driver had said. "No," Aili said. "The wind is the same for every chimney here. Look at the cookhouse." The cookhouse smoke went straight up. A teamster crossed the yard with a peavey over his shoulder and told her the cookhouse was the other way, that women went to the cook. Aili asked for the foreman instead. The man looked at Miko and at the satchel, and something in his face changed. "Company man's coming in a week," he said, as if that settled who she was and why she should not have come. "Inspector, if this place don't pass, they scatter us." He nodded at the smoke. "So you picked a poor week to beg." "I did not come to beg," Aili said. "That chimney is not sick from weak wind. It was built wrong. I can hear it from here." The teamster laughed, but he went to find Rowan Mercer. Rowan Mercer came out of the bunkhouse without a coat, which told Aili he did not mean to be long. He was tall and thick through the shoulders, past 40, with the still way of a man who had learned to read a leaning tree before it decided to fall. He looked at the woman, then at the boy asleep on her shoulder, then at the girl with the closed mitten. "Get them to the cookhouse," Rowan said. "Both of them. Hot food first. We'll talk after." "Put the meal on my account," Aili said. Against work I have not yet done. Rowan stopped. Men did not usually argue their way toward paying. There's no account, he said. There will be, said Aili. I do not take what I have not earned. Feed my children now and hold it against me. That is not the same as charity, and my daughter knows the difference even if you do not. Elma's mitten did not open, but she looked at her mother and then at Rowan, and Aili saw the girl weighing him. Inside the cookhouse, Rafe Bisson, the cook, set down 2 bowls of pork and beans and a plate of biscuits, with the flat face of a man whose stores had just been counted for the winter and did not need 3 more mouths in them. Mikko woke enough to eat. Then his cheek came down against the rim of the bowl, and he slept sitting up, too tired to finish, and Rafe looked at the boy for a moment and looked away. The bunkhouse filled with smoke while they ate. It came in a slow tide from the north end, hazing the lamps. A loud swamper named Leander Moss watched Aili study the fireplace through the murk and grinned. There she is, Leander said to the room. Mercer's got 58 axemen waiting on a mud mason and 2 hungry young ones. Rowan did not laugh, and he did not tell Leander to stop. He asked Aili what she saw. Aili set down her spoon. The stones above the opening are black with old soot and fallen mortar, so something up there is choked. The opening is too wide and too tall, so the fire warms the room a little and the chimney a great deal, and the smoke rolls forward under that shelf of stone instead of turning up. Watch it. It comes to a lip and it falls into the room, every time. The men watched. The smoke did what she said it would. I want no wages this week, Aili said. She said it plainly, the way a person names a price. Feed my children through winter. Give us a dry corner with a door. I will make your chimney draw, and I will put the heat where your men can use it. And if you can't, Rowan said, then we leave on the next sled and you have lost 7 days and 3 meals. Rowan was quiet. He believed she saw more than the men laughing behind her. He also had 58 lives sleeping in that smoke and a company examiner coming to close him down. Both of those were true at once. 7 days, he said. You get the office. Stores stay with Rafe, and the inspector decides, not me. I need one more thing, Aili said. When I say so, no fire in that hearth. Not for warmth, not for coffee. A chimney cannot be read while it is burning. The men objected all at once. A North Minnesota bunkhouse without a fire in November was a hard thing to ask. Rowan raised one hand and they stopped. She kills the fire tomorrow, he said. We wear our coats one morning. If any man can't stand that, he can go cut wood in it instead. Aili carried Mikko to the office that had been shut since a woman named May Mercer died in it. She told the men there would be no morning fire. Elma lay down without eating the bread in her mitten. She was still saving it for the morning Rowan changed his mind. At first light the fire was out, and the hearth was cold, and Aili went to work. She had the men rake out the ash. Then she hung strips of raw wool at 6 points across the wide opening, pinned to a stick laid over the top, and lit nothing but a twist of paper low in the firebox. The men crowded the doorway to watch a woman burn a scrap of paper. 3 of the lower wool strips leaned in toward the fire. The 2 highest strips did not move at all. One near the top edge pushed out into the room. There, Aili said. The fire wants to pull, but up high nothing pulls because up high something is blocked. And here? She touched the strip that pointed the wrong way. The smoke is spilling back at you before it ever climbs. Tomasz Radecki, the blacksmith, had come to see the tools she would need and stayed for the wool. He grunted. It was not agreement. It was interest. Aili tied a weight to a length of line and lowered it down the flue from a ladder against the outside stones. The The weight stopped far short of the hearth. "Something fell in," she said. "A quarter of the throat is closed, maybe more. Old mortar. And a nest from the smell." She took off her coat and went into the firebox on her back, into the cold soot, with Rowan holding the rope at her ankles and Elma calling how far the line had left to go. Down came a fall of hardened mortar and the black wreck of a squirrel's nest, and Aili came out gray to the elbows. The next paper test was better. The high strips moved now, but the strip near the front lip still pushed the wrong way. "Clearing it is not enough," Aili said, wiping her face. "The opening is still too big and the smoke still rolls under that shelf. We have to make the fireplace smaller." That was a hard sentence in a cold camp. The men had trusted that hearth, such as it was, for a year. While the office was being cleared for her, Rowan found a narrow child's bunk standing against the wall under a stack of horse blankets. He had built it himself once and never finished the rails. He set it down by the stove and reached for the saw because it was dry wood and the camp was always short of dry wood. "It's kindling," Rowan said when he felt Aili watching. "It is already something else," Aili said. Rowan looked at the little bunk a moment. Then he set the saw down and leaned the bunk back against the wall. Aili marked the new firebox line on the old stones in chalk, a smaller box inside the big one, and told the men they would be tearing out a fireplace they had leaned on all year and building a smaller one they did not yet trust. That night at supper, Elma's hand went to her mitten twice and came away empty each time, and Rowan watched her from the far end of the table and said nothing. The next morning, a second biscuit sat beside her bowl, set there as though the cook had miscounted. The morning after that, another. Rafe Bisson had counted his stores too close to the bone to miscount anything, and Elma was old enough to know it. She ate the one that was given. She kept the hard piece in her mitten still. But she ate the biscuit, and that was a beginning. They salvaged fired brick from a collapsed boiler footing at the edge of the yard, hard old brick that had already met fire and lived. Tomasz forged flat iron bars to carry the masonry above the opening. Aili laid a new rear wall of that brick, closer to the room than the old one, and raised it, and set the side walls at an angle so they would throw heat forward instead of swallowing it. Elma measured every course with a leather thong, marked at each foot, worn soft, the marks near rubbed away. It had been her father's. Aili Korpela had used it to true a wagon bed, and Elma had oiled it for him, and she knew each faded mark by touch, even where the eye could no longer find it. She held it against the brick and read the height aloud, and 2 grown men waited on her number before they laid the next course, because Rowan had told them to wait. It was the first work Elma took up without first asking whether they would be paid in food. The men did not like the shrinking firebox. Radecki said it plainly. The room was losing half its fireplace. "It has been heating the chimney," Aili said. "The chimney does not sleep here. Your men do." She built a curve of wet-daubed board where the flat shelf had been, a rounded false breast over temporary wooden centering, so the smoke would slide up instead of tumbling forward off a lip. She narrowed the throat to a slot running most of the width. The mortar was screened river clay cut with sharp sand and the dust of crushed fired brick, so it would grip and not merely shrink. Into the middle of that came Niles Rusk. Rusk ran North Cut number 3, a day off through the timber, and he came in on a fast cutter with 2 of his own men. His camp was behind quota and short of teamsters, and if Black Spruce closed, its horses and its best axemen would come to him. He did not say that. He looked at the half-torn hearth and the woman with clay to her wrists. "Mercer," Rusk said, "I've iron stoves that draw clean and never smoked a night in their lives. You've got a mud mason pulling your chimney apart in November." He turned to the crew. Any man wants a warm bunk and his winter wages. North Cuts Road is open, for now. Two of the younger men looked at their boots. Nobody's leaving, Rowan said. Rusk looked at Eili's brickwork a long moment, the way a man looks at something he intends to remember. Then he climbed back onto his cutter. Week from now, he said, you'll wish you'd sent the woman with me. Rowan told two of the impatient men that the next brick did not go in until Elma read the thong. They waited. Elma read it. That night, after Aili had gone to the office to see to Miko, one of the crew fed the fresh hearth, a curing fire far bigger than she had allowed, wanting warmth faster than she meant to give it. By morning, 2 cracks had opened across the new facing, and smoke had stained one seam black. The men saw it first and decided the whole thing had failed. Leander said what several were thinking. There it is, Leander said. Mrs. Korpela's mud coffin, cracked before it's a week old. Aili knelt at the hearth and put her thumb along the cracks. She could have named the man who built the big fire in the night. She did not. Who fed it hot last night? She asked. No one answered. She nodded slowly, as if the silence were its own kind of answer. Then that is my mistake, not his. A thing that only works when every man obeys is not built for a camp. It is built for a church. I will build one for a camp. She took a short trowel and knocked the cracked coat off the brick, a full day's work, back to bare masonry. Then she handed Leander a mixing shovel. You named it, she said. You can help me mix the next one. Leander looked at the shovel as if it might bite. The room was watching. He took it. The new mortar got more sharp sand and more brick dust, so it would move with the heat instead of tearing. Aili laid it in thin coats, not one thick shell, and lit only small fires, a little more each time, to cure it slow from the inside out. Rowan came in from the woods that evening and, without a word, set a stack of old damp cloths beside her. They had been maize from the days she cooked in this camp and kept the fireboxes from drying too fast. Aili laid the damp cloths over the fresh face between the little fires so the outside would not dry ahead of the core. She did not thank him, and he did not wait to be thanked. The cookhouse bake oven had smoked for a year the same as the bunkhouse, and Rafe had learned to hate his own fire. Between coats of mortar, Aili spent an hour at that oven, pulled a fallen brick from its short flue, and pared the throat the way she had drawn the big one. Then she lit it. The oven drew clean for the first time since it was laid, and Rafe baked the evening's bread without once opening a door to the cold. He said nothing to Aili about it, but the next morning there were dried apples in Miko's porridge, apples Rafe had been keeping back for Christmas, and no one asked where they had come from. They were on the 6th day when the sleigh bells came up the tote road, and the rebuilt face was not yet fully cured. Merritt Quaid was 56, the company's master mechanic and its winter safety examiner, and he had come to condemn a fireplace. He was slow and difficult, and he was not impressed by anyone's confidence, least of all his own. He put his hand on Tomash's iron support bars and pulled at the mortar joints with a knife. He looked up the cleared flue with a mirror shard and a candle. He asked what carried the masonry above the opening, and Aili told him, the iron bars, and named their span. He asked whether the fresh clay had cured, and Aili told him the truth, that it had not fully cured, that she would show him a small fire and no more. Rusk had timed his second visit for the inspection and stood at the back expecting to watch a closure. Aili laid a small fire and lit it. The wool strips leaned toward the throat, all of them now, even the high ones. The smoke went up and stayed up. Close the doors, Quaid said, and the shutters. All of them. They sealed the bunkhouse, With 58 men and no way in for fresh air, the flame shortened and a curl of smoke bent out into the room. There, Rusk said. Same as always. Aili slid open a low iron plate she had set into the hearth floor, an air channel that ran in under the wall from the sheltered side. The flame heard it. It stretched and leaned back toward the throat, and the smoke climbed again. You have been smothering your own fire to keep your own heat, Aili said to the room and not to Rusk. The fire needs to breathe from outside, or it breathes from you. Quaid watched the flame stand up. He was quiet for a while. I don't believe your notion will heat this whole room, he said at last, and I don't approve overnight fires on clay that cured in 6 days. You should not, Aili said. Not until the figures say it has. Quaid looked at her differently then. He granted a limited daytime fire, small, watched, and 3 weeks of records before he would sign off on anything more. When Aili laid out her plan for a heated bench built from the old deacon seat, he did not laugh, which was worse than laughing. He asked how such a bench would start when it was stone cold, and how a man would ever clean the soot out of channels he could not see. Aili had no good answer to the cold start question. She said so. Quaid noticed Elma in the corner copying his questions onto a scrap of board with a nub of charcoal. He crossed the room, took a proper pencil from his coat, and set it down beside her without a word, and went back to the hearth. That night, Aili sat over her chalk drawings a long time. The bench, as she had drawn it, had no answer to the thing Quaid had asked. A cold channel would not pull. She had drawn a bench that could not light itself. They took up the old wooden deacon seat that had run the length of the bunkhouse for a year and numbered every board because the wood would come back as backrests. Under it, they built a footing of fieldstone on the packed earth. On that, a long, low box of brick and stone, 18 inches high and 14 feet long, with 2 broad channels running through it, so that hot gas from the fire could travel under the seat before it climbed the chimney. 3 iron doors, forged by Tomasz, let a man reach in and scrape each channel clean. Aili faced the whole thing in her clay and sand mortar and set the numbered seat boards on a wooden rail held off the masonry by a finger's gap of air, so no spark could reach the wood. Elma set the rise of the channels with Eero's thong, one end in her hand, one end in Rowan's. She read the drop toward the chimney, and Rowan marked it. It was the first time since her father died that a grown decision waited on her word, and she stood very straight while she read. Rowan asked for paper to track the wood, and Aili asked him for a ledger. He unlocked a wooden box he had not opened in 3 winters and took out May's supply ledger. The early pages were flour and salt pork and dried apples, and small notes in a careful hand about which men were coughing and which were eating too little. Aili turned to a clean page and did not remark on the rest, and Rowan did not explain it. The men laughed when Aili told them they would one day sit on the chimney's wasted heat. Then she lit the first full fire in the finished bench, and the laughing had some ground under it, because the smoke went into the bench and stalled. The far channel stayed cold. The draft died in the long, cold passage, and smoke backed up and spilled into the room, and the men swore and threw the doors open, and days of cold nights felt wasted. Aili killed the fire. She opened every clean-out door and knelt and studied which way the soot had smeared. I made it carry heat before I taught it how to start, she said. The channels were too long and turned too often, and a cold bench would always choke a cold fire. She had built the very thing Quaid warned her of. Tomasz was already looking at her. You want iron, he said. A plate above the firebox, Aili said. One way sends the fire straight up the chimney to warm it. The other way sends it through the bench, a bypass. We warm the flue first, then we feed the bench. Tomasz went to his forge that night. Rowan stayed and worked beside Aili, moving stone, and at some point Mikko came out of the office in his nightshirt and fell asleep against the warm brick of the firebox, and Rowan took off his own coat and laid it over the boy and kept working in his shirt sleeves. The word came down the tote road that the weather would break below zero before Tomasz could finish the damper. They tested the cold start with the new iron bypass 3 days later, in a bunkhouse cold enough to see breath. Aili set the plate to send the fire straight up. She lit a small hot fire and let it run until the main chimney was warm and pulling hard. Then she shifted the plate, and the gas turned down into the bench, and the long channels took it because they were no longer cold and no longer had to start the draft themselves. The men put their bare hands on the brick and felt it come up warm, slow, the length of the seat. Then a gust caught the outside air intake, which Aili had faced too far to the north, and blew a breath of cold straight across the hearth and scattered ash into the room. "I placed it wrong," Aili said. "You promised to fix the chimney," Rowan said. "You never promised to guess every wind." They moved the hood to the sheltered side of the wall, turned its mouth down so the wind could not drive straight through it, and set a low snow fence a few feet off to break the gusts. Overnight the bench held warm long after the fire had burned down to coals, and the readings were better everywhere but one far corner, which stayed colder than Aili wanted. She wrote the corner down. She did not pretend it was warm. Owen Firth, who ran the stable, came in that same cold night to see the bench for himself. He put a hand on the warm brick, then asked Aili the one question none of the others had thought to ask, whether the same trick of a low sheltered inlet might keep the wind from cutting in under his stable door and stealing the heat off his horses. Aili said it might. They walked out together into the dark to look at the door, and Owen showed her how fast a team lost its warmth once the wind got beneath it, and what that would mean if the wind ever meant to stay. Before dawn, she went into the bunkhouse to lay the first fire and found 2 cups set out by the hearth. One was her own plain tin cup. The other was a blue enamel cup with a white chip at the rim. Rowan was already outside in the dark, checking the stable. Aili looked at the 2 cups a while. Then she filled them both and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the thing itself. For 3 weeks, Elma kept the ledger under May's old entries, and the figures did the arguing that talk could not. She wrote the outside cold at dawn and midnight, the warmth at 4 points in the room, the bench surface, the number of 4-foot sticks burned each watch, every time the fire spilled smoke, the set of the damper, the wind, and whether wet clothes hung drying. Before the repairs, the fire had smoked at nearly every lighting. Ice had formed on the wash water in the corner bunks, and a cold night ate 10 sticks or more. After the fire lit clean in minutes when the men followed the sequence, the smoke stayed out of the room. The bench held warm for hours, the corners came up, and the wood dropped by near a quarter on a matched night. Quaid came back, found the drying curtain hung too close to the hot masonry, and made them move it, tested every clean out, and read every page. Then he signed his conditional approval, with rules written in his own hand about how the damper must be worked and who might touch it. Russ came back too. He said one cold snap proved nothing and refused to lend his spare iron stove, because his own men might yet need it. Before he left, he offered the crew a standing place at North Cut and their full winter wages if they came over before Christmas, before the deep cold shut the roads and trapped them at Black Spruce with a clay bench and a woman's promises. Rowan did not answer Rusk. He waited until the cutter was gone and asked Aili a different question. "How many days of wood?" Rowan said. "If his roads blocked 20 days, and no sled gets through. Aili counted the pile in her head. 16 days at the old rate, she said. Perhaps 21 at the new one. That's not enough. No, said Aili. It is not. Then we cut ahead, Rowan said. We prepare for 28. Elma was near the office shelf when they said it, where the last piece of bread from Winton Crossing still lay in a fold of cloth, gone hard. She had left it 3 days now, untouched, since the first night the bench came up warm. She looked at it. Then she crumbled it and set the crumbs on the sill for a camp mouse and closed the ledger and went to help her mother count sticks. The signs came the next afternoon before anyone spoke the word for them. A thaw had softened the snow at midday. Then, without a wind to explain it, the thaw stopped. The wet crust set hard as iron. Owen Firth stood at the stable fence and watched his horses. They had all turned to face away from the northwest and would not turn back, and Owen came across the yard to tell Rowan so, because horses knew a thing before a thermometer did. Sound carried wrong through the timber, close and flat, as if the trees stood nearer than they were. The thermometer nailed to the office wall fell 20 degrees before supper and kept falling. The men came in from the last of the cutting with their collars white, and the cookhouse smoke, which had climbed straight all week, stopped climbing. It bent down and slid along the snow toward the trees, the way the bunkhouse smoke had slid the day Aili walked in. Merritt Quaid had meant to leave that morning while the road was open. He looked at the sky and at the horses and put his bag back in the office. Aili stood in the yard and watched the cookhouse smoke flatten. A boy came up the tote road on snowshoes with a note from North Cut. Rusk had written that Mercer was throwing away his quota to hide behind a scare, and that any man of his who wanted paid work could still walk the day's road to a warm iron stove. Rowan folded the note and put it in his coat and did not read it aloud. He came and stood beside Aili and looked northwest, where the light had gone the color of old iron. Bring the teams in, Rowan said. All of them, before dark. Everything they could build was built. The bench was cured, the bypass hung, the intake faced right, the ledger full as good figures, and not one of them yet knew whether it was enough. They had 2 days. Rowan halted all cutting and put the whole crew on the camp. Wood came in from the yard piles to within a rope's length of the bunkhouse door, 28 days of it, stacked so a man could find it blind. Tomasz swept every bench channel through the clean outdoors and forged a spare locking pin for the bypass in case the first dropped into the snow and was lost. Owen Firth banked the stable doors with snow and brushed the way Aili's inlet had taught him, so the wind could not get under and rob the horses of their heat. They strung guide ropes shoulder high between the bunkhouse, the cookhouse, the office, and the stable, and tied pale strips of cloth along them at arm's length, so a man in a whiteout could count his way home by touch. Aili raised the marker pole beside the air intake higher, above where she judged the snow would climb. She did not yet know she had judged it low. Miko watched the ropes go up and asked why they needed the ropes and the poles both. A rope keeps a man from drifting off the path, Aili said. The poles tell him whether he is still going somewhere or only walking in a circle. Rowan finished the child's bunk at last. He cut the rails he had left uncut for 3 winters, fitted them, and carried the little bunk out and set it near the cooler end of the warm bench, where a small boy could sleep without being scorched. Over it he laid a wool blanket that had been maize. He did it without a word, and Aili laid her hand once on the finished rail and took it away again. She hung Eero's repair satchel on the peg beside the outer door, where it would be to hand. The strap he had double-stitched was still sound. She tugged it twice, the way Eero had always tugged a harness twice before he trusted it, and told herself it was only a habit and knew it was not. May's ledger went to the office table, in reach. Elma was given the fire schedule in writing, in her own hand, when to feed the bench and when to hold it, and when to run the cold start sequence. And Rowan told the crew that on the fire, the girl's word was his word. Merritt Quaid watched all of it and told them the plain danger. A sealed camp in that cold was as likely to smother as to freeze, he said. The system would carry them only while a waking man kept the intake open and the channels clear and worked the sequence in order. The night no one stood over it was the night it would kill them. He said it flatly, the way a man states a load a beam can carry, and then he set his bag down for good. He would not risk the road now for any wage. Rowan read the crew for the 2 days like he read a leaning tree. He put the steadiest men on the night watches and the youngest ones where he could see them. He checked the wood stack himself twice, and the stable banking, and the guide ropes, hand over hand, all the way to the stable and back, so that his hands would know the road in the dark the same as any man's. The thermometer, which had fallen 20 degrees before supper, fell 20 more before midnight. The wind came before the second midnight, and it did not sound like other wind. It came out of the northwest in one long push that did not stop to breathe. Snow drove flat under the eaves and hissed against the shakes. The men who had gone for the last stable check came in with frost stiff on their collars and their beards white, and stamped it off and said nothing, which was how the crew said a thing was bad. Aili worked the cold start sequence the way she had drilled it. Bypass open. A small hot fire, straight up the chimney until the flue pulled hard and clean. Then the plate over, and the gas turned down into the bench, and the long channels took it because they were warm now and did not have to start the draft cold. The rounded throat held. No smoke rolled into the room. Elma sat at the office table with the schedule in front of her and the ledger open, and she called the feedings. So many sticks now, she said, and hold, and the men fed the fire on the girl's word and no other. She wrote the bench readings every hour, near end and far end, and the cold outside and the wind, in the same book where May had once written who was coughing and who ate too little. The near end of the bench held even. The far end held even. She wrote them down. The bench came up slow along its length. The men crowded onto it in shifts, shoulder to shoulder, and the ones who had called it a mud coffin sat on it and put their backs against the numbered old seat boards and warmed through for the first time in a month. One of them said to no one that a man could get used to sitting on a chimney. No one laughed at him, and no one agreed out loud, which was its own kind of agreeing. Wet wool steamed off 58 men and hung heavy in the air. Aili cracked the roof vent above the drying rail, a hand's width, to let the damp climb out without pulling smoke from the hearth. Rafe came from the cookhouse along the covered passage with hot food and carried it to the bench itself, and pressed an extra piece into Miko's hands where the boy sat wrapped in May's blanket at the cool end and stood a moment over him before he went back down the passage into the roar. The first night held. The camp let out a breath, the way a crew does when it decides too early that a thing is beaten. Then the coal kept falling after the camp had already reached the worst number in Elma's ledger, and kept falling still. The reading Elma wrote at the 4th hour was one she had never written before, and the reading at the 5th hour was lower. Near the far end of the bench, she found the reason the draft had begun to soften. The far readings had started to slip, a degree, then 2. The outside intake was drifting shut faster than anyone had planned for, and the fire, robbed of air, had begun to reach back into the room for it. Leander Moss and Owen Firth went out to settle a horse gone wild with the noise, and to clear the intake on the way back. Only Owen came in. He came in half blind, holding the guide rope hand over hand, and said Leander had let go of the rope to clear the pole and had not caught it again. The guideline outside was crusted with rime and half buried, and the cloth strips had gone stiff as boards. Rowan started for his coat. Aili stopped him for the length of one measurement. She took Eero's thong from the satchel and read off the reach from the door to the intake pole, and paid out the search line to that mark and no more, and knotted it there, so Rowan would know by the knot in his hand the moment he had gone as far as the pole and should go no farther into the white. It was her husband's leather that set the length of the line, marked in a hand that had trued a wagon bed years before, and neither of them said so. Rowan followed the guide rope out. The door shut behind him, and the roar took him. Inside there was nothing to do but hold the far end and count. Outside the world had closed to the length of his own arm. He went hand over hand along the crusted rope, past the first cloth strip, past the second, the wind driving the breath sideways out of him. At the knot he stopped. Below the pole, in the drift, he found a shape that was not snow. He found Leander less than 20 feet off the bunkhouse door, on his knees, one hand locked on the marker pole beside the air intake. He had missed the door and found the pole, and he had not stopped for himself. He had dug the packed snow out of the intake mouth with his bare hands and would not let go of the pole to be pulled in until the mouth was clear. Rowan got an arm under him and brought him back along the rope, the two of them low against the ground, and hauled him through the door into the light and the steam. Inside they got his mittens off and his boots off and worked the white out of his fingers slow. His first words were not thanks. "Your fire was choking," Leander said. "I cleared it." Then later, when he could feel his hands again, he said the other thing. "I found the rope because I was looking for the thing I laughed at." He took the next watch on the intake himself, and every watch after, and no one argued him out of it. But the opening filled again within the hour, faster than a man could keep it clear, and Quaid, walking the bench with a lantern, stopped at the far clean-out and put his face close to the seam. "There's soot coming out here," Quaid said. "That has no business coming out here." The temperature went down through 40 below, and the far end of the bench went cold. The surface readings, which had run even the length of the seat, began to split. The near end held its heat. The far end fell away, a degree at a time, faster than the fire could feed it. A thread of smoke lifted off the far clean-out seam and hung under the rafters, and the men beneath it began to cough, and moved, and the coughing followed them down the room. Aili shifted the bypass to send the fire straight up the chimney and take the load off the failing bench. The direct path answered, but slower than it had any right to be, as if the throat itself had drawn tight. She held her hand near the hearth and felt the pull come and go, where it should have been steady. Something had moved inside. She opened the clean-out doors one after another, kneeling the length of the cold bench, and read the soot in the lantern light. Near the firebox it lay clean and thin. Toward the return it smeared and piled and swirled where it should have run smooth and straight. The cold and the shaking of the wind and the long pull of 4 nights of fire had worked a slab of old mortar loose somewhere in the throat above, and it had dropped across the return and half closed it. She reached in with the spoon-shaped soot scraper from Eero's satchel into the near clean-out and felt for the block and could not touch it. She tried the next door and the next, lying flat on the cold floor with her arm buried in the channel to the shoulder. "It's fallen where I can't reach it from in here," Aili said. "Not from any door inside. The only way to it is the old outside clean-out at the foot of the chimney." The old outside clean-out was under the deepest drift on the north wall, in the full teeth of the wind. Rowan pulled the fire down small, so the smoke would have less to make. They moved the men off the smoking end to the warm end and down onto the floor where the air was cleaner. They carried Mikko to the office, feverish and light, and Elma went with him and settled him and came back to the ledger. The bench would give back its banked heat for a few hours yet on what it had stored. Not till morning, a few hours only. Elma did the sum in the ledger, the stored heat against the cold, and the hours till dawn, and said the number of hours out loud in a steady voice, and it was not enough hours. Outside, the thermometer had gone to nearly 50 below. By the fourth night of the Black Spruce Freeze, the camp had vanished. There was no yard, no line between one building and the next, only the roar and the flat white nothing driving sideways past the door. Aili and Rowan divided it without argument. Quaid said Rowan should be the one to go out. Rowan was the bigger man and the stronger. He can find the door, Aili said. I can find what fell. She took Eero's satchel off its peg and looped its doubled strap over her wrist. This is masonry. It is mine. Rowan did not argue the division of the work. He had learned that much. She tied the rope around her waist and put the other end in his hands, and went out along the guideline into the white. The cold took her breath at the door. She went hand over hand, low, the wind trying to peel her off the rope, past the first cloth strip and the second to the corner of the north wall where the chimney stood. The world was gone. There was the rope and the roar and the burning cold on the skin of her face and nothing else in it. Inside, Elma stood at the ledger with the schedule in her hand and called the minutes aloud so the room could hear them. Tomasz stood at the bypass, one hand on the mark plate, waiting on the girl's word and no one else's. Quaid watched the smoke line where it lay against the rafters, ready to say the moment it dropped toward the men. Leander held the air intake clear against the drift, hands wrapped, refusing to be spelled. Owen held the stable rope because 26 horses stood stiffening behind a frozen door, and someone had to be ready for them if the wall of a barn began to lose its heat. Mikko lay fevered in the finished bunk under May's wool blanket, and every few minutes Rowan's eyes went to the office door and came back to the rope running out through his hands into the dark. Aili came to the foot of the chimney by feel and found the outside clean-out buried under a shoulder of packed drift. She dug at it with a short ash shovel, and the wind filled the hole almost as fast as she opened it, throwing the snow back in her face. Her lashes froze together. Her sleeves froze to armor at the wrist. She dug and cleared and dug again and lost ground and gained it and got her fingers at last to the iron door. A gust took the satchel off the snow and tore it out of her hand. Eero's doubled strap, looped over her wrist, snapped tight and held, and the trowel and the two iron wedges swung against her arm and did not go down into the drift to be lost until spring. She pulled the satchel back to her by the strap he had stitched. She got the clean-out open. She reached into the throat of the chimney and found the slab, a flat wedge of old mortar dropped square across the return, cold and set fast where it had fallen. She braced the soot scraper against it and pushed. It did not move. She got the narrow trowel behind it and pried. It did not move. She took Eero's iron wedge, the least likely tool in the bag, the one nobody checks, and drove it into the gap above the slab, and leaned her whole weight on it. The rope jerked once, then it went slack. Inside, Rowan felt the line go dead in his hands. He was moving before he knew it, toward the door, toward the white that had already nearly taken one man tonight. The line jerked twice, hard, deliberate, 2 long pulls. He stopped with his hand on the latch. A third pull came, steady and even, the signal they had never spoken aloud but both understood. Outside, the slab broke and fell away down the flue into the ash pit below, and the return throat stood open, and Aili felt the cold air draw past her raw hand and down, and knew by her hand that it had cleared. Direct path first, Elma said inside, reading her own schedule, and put out her arm to hold 2 men twice her size where they stood, because they wanted to help, and helping wrong would kill the draft. Tomasz set the plate straight up and sent the fire into the newly cleared chimney and let it climb and warm and take hold. Only when Elma gave the next word did he turn the plate over, and the gas went back down through the bench, and the far clean-out stopped bleeding smoke into the room. The flame at the hearth leaned, guttered, wavered, and stood up straight and stayed. Aili came in along the rope with frost-caked white on her lashes, and her sleeves gone stiff as stovepipe. Rowan hauled the door shut behind her against the wind and set his back to it. "Will it hold?" Rowan said. "Until morning," said Aili. Rowan looked toward the office door, where his coat lay over a sleeping boy in the bunk he had once meant to burn. "Morning is enough." The fourth morning came gray and still and murderously cold, and every man in the bunkhouse was alive. They counted. 58 men, 3 cookhouse workers, Tomasz, the 2 leads, 2 children, all alive. The horses had all lived, though 2 showed frost on their ears that Owen would tend for weeks. The camp had come through the black Spruce Freeze whole. The men began to cheer it. It was the kind of morning that wanted cheering. Aili opened May's ledger and began to write down what had failed. One clean-out door had warped in the heat and would no longer seat true. The air intake hood had filled too fast and would have to be raised again and hooded deeper, and a second pole set beside the first. The return throat had shed a slab that should never have been loose and would want rebuilding in fired brick when the thaw came. The far end of the bench had run cold when the near end held, so the channels wanted balancing. And the near end had run hotter than she had ever meant it to, hot enough to want watching. She wrote them all down, one under the other, in a plain column, on the morning the system had kept every soul in the room alive. Leander watched her write and could not make sense of it. "You saved us," Leander said. "The whole camp. Why are you setting down what went wrong?" Aili did not look up from the page. "A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success," she said. "It carried us this time because we stood over it all night with our hands on it. Another night no one may be standing there. So we find every fault now while the night is fresh in us, and we mend it before it can choose its own hour." The men grew quiet at that. They had cheered a morning. Now they understood that living through the dark was not the same as the thing being sound, and that the woman who had come up their road with 2 hungry children meant to make it sound, and would not be talked out of it by her own success. Owen went to his horses. 2 had frost on their ears he would dress for weeks, but 2 was a small count for such a night, and he knew it, and he did not say so out loud. Merritt Quaid took half a day with the ledger. He laid the pages side by side and matched night against night. The cold outside against the wood burned, the corner bunks before the repairs and after, the smoke events, the hours the bench held its heat past the last fire, the nights the sequence was worked right against, the one night it went wrong. He did not hurry, and no one hurried him. When he was done, he wrote his report. The system was safe, he wrote, when its rules were kept and its channels stayed open, and he set down the rules again in his own hand. He recommended the return be rebuilt in fired brick at the thaw. He recommended one thing more, that the company send Aili Korpela to any camp attempting the like, to build it and to teach it. He said the plain sentence to the room before he closed the book. "This did not work because she promised it would," Quaid said. "It worked because she wrote down every time it did not." Niles Russ came when the road opened 3 days later on the same fast cutter. His men had lived, but his camp had burned near twice the wood-black spruce had burned in the same 4 nights, and a stovepipe joint had let go on the worst night and filled one end of his bunkhouse with smoke, and 2 of his men were coughing still. He walked around Aili's bench once. Then he walked around it again, slower, and crouched at the clean outdoors and looked into the channels, and stood and looked at the bypass plate with its 2 notches worn where a thumb found them in the dark. "Who cut these clean-outs?" Rusk asked Rowan. Rowan pointed at Aili. Rusk was quiet a moment. Whatever it cost him, he spent it. "I do not want your bench," he said to Aili. "I want the measurements." "Show me your installation," Aili said, "and I will give you every figure I have, on one condition. Quaid inspects the work before a man sleeps beside it." Rusk looked at Quaid, and at the ledger open on the table, and at the woman he had offered to carry off in his cutter 9 weeks before, when she had clay to her wrists and a camp full of men laughing behind her. "Show me," Rusk said. He stayed the afternoon and copied every figure into a book of his own and asked his questions, and Aili answered them the way she answered Quaid, plainly, holding nothing back. He left before dark to beat the cold home. At the door he stopped and looked once more at the long, warm bench. "I called it a mud coffin, too," Rusk said, "in my own camp, where nobody could hear me." Then he was gone down the road. The company superintendent came up in March when the road had firmed. Rowan expected him to pay Aili off for the Chimney and send her down the tote road with her children before the spring drive. That was how it was done. Instead, the superintendent laid a paper on the office table that the crew had signed, near every man of them, some with a careful signature and more with a mark. It said the widow Korpela had held the fuel closer than any clerk they had known, had kept the heat ledger through the 4 nights of the freeze, had made the sleeping corners fit for a man to lie in, had given the storm orders that grown and experienced men had obeyed without argument, and had read the ration book as well as she read the firebox. It asked the company, plainly, to keep her. The superintendent read the room and made his offer: the post of camp steward and operations clerk, wages of her own, family quarters, authority over the fuel, the stores, the cleanliness, and the heat of Black Spruce No. 7. Aili read the paper through twice, the way she read anything she meant to trust, and then asked for one thing to be added before she would put her name to it. The children's right to the quarters, she said, must not hang on whether she and Rowan Mercer stayed of one mind. Put that in the company's own writing, or she would not sign a line of it. The superintendent looked at Rowan. Rowan said nothing that would have stopped it, and let the silence be his answer. The clause was written in the company's ink, in the company's book. When the man had gone back down the tote road, Rowan turned the paper on the table with one finger. "You made them put in writing what I should have said the first night," Rowan said. "Writing lasts longer than a kind intention," said Aili. The thaw came, and Rusk's promised brick came with it. 2 crates of fired brick sent up the road on a company sled with no note attached and no word spoken, and they rebuilt the return the way Quaid had asked, in hard brick that had already met fire once and lived. They balanced the channels so the far end held with the near. They raised the intake hood and set Owen's second pole. They mended every line in Aili's column, one under the other, until the column was crossed through. The spring drive began, and the river carried the winter's logs down toward the mill in a brown flood. Aili ran the stores and kept the heat ledger the year round now, summer and winter both. Elma worked the drive as a junior tally clerk, calling logs past the boom in a clear voice that grown men wrote down without a second look, the way they had once waited on her father's thong against a course of brick. Leander mended his old boot mark in the bench for good, smoothed it under his own hand until it could not be found. Beneath the seat he carved a small arrow pointing toward the air intake, so that any man who ever sat there in the dark would know which way the life of the room lay. Every evening before he sat, he walked out and checked the marker. He did not speak of the night he had knelt at that pole. He did not need to. The arrow said it. One evening after breakup at the stove, Rowan set May's blue enamel cup down beside Eili's plain tin cup, the way the two cups had first sat together on that cold dawn when nothing was settled and nothing was said. "The company says you can stay for the next cutting season," Rowan said. "The company is not the question," said Aili. Rowan looked at the two cups a while. "I'd like you to stay after the road's dry." Aili looked at them too. "Longer than that?" "Longer than that?" No more was said. It did not need saying. The two cups said it, standing side by side on the shelf. A small ceremony was held after the log drive, witnessed by Merritt Quaid, who stood up beside them as square and unhurried as he had stood over the ledger. Rusk did not come, but the 2 crates of brick had been his blessing, and every man in the camp knew it, and no one thought the worse of him for staying at Northcut with his figures. Owen built a fresh intake marker and painted it white so the falling snow would show dark against it, and a man could find it blind. Miko took to asking Rowan to lift him onto the warm bench, and one summer morning called him Pa Rowan, and by the next month had worn it down to Pa. Elma began with Rowan, as she had always called him, and moved after a while to Pa Rowan, and let the shorter word come in its own season, the way she let most things come, when she had measured them and found them sound. She wrote one line inside the front of May's ledger, under a new cover, in her clear tally clerk's hand. Mercer Korpela Quarters. She looked at it a long moment, the way she looked at a number she was checking. Then she closed the book, and she did not erase it. Black Spruce No. 7 did not live through the Black Spruce Freeze because its men grew tough. They were tough already. They had learned to sleep and smoke and call it an ordinary thing. It lived because Aili refused to call a tolerated failure ordinary and measured what toughness had been hiding. The chimney drew because its faults were dragged into the light. The bench held its heat because its first shape did not and was rebuilt. A man came home out of the white because someone had planned for the hour a man could no longer see. The ledger proved more than any boast in the room. Rowan Mercer did not save the widow and her children. Aili Korpela did not save the camp alone. He gave her authority where she had earned it. She gave his endurance something to be for, beyond outlasting one more winter. The rebuilt deacon seat stands warm along the old bunkhouse wall. May's blue cup and Eili's tin cup rest on the shelf above it, and beneath them 3 smaller cups. Arrow's leather thong hangs beside the damper instructions. Miko sleeps in the bunk Rowan once meant to burn. Outside, the spring water carries the winter's logs down to the mill. Inside, no one opens the door to let the smoke out. There's no smoke left to release.